Good evening. My name is Ingrid Reed, and I serve on the board of the Princeton Adult School and the Lecture Committee. And tonight, I am very, very pleased to welcome Lisa Belkin. I think if you've followed the series and the topics, you'll know that tonight we have a chance to hear about communications for the 21st century from someone who has experienced the changes firsthand and is going to discuss them with us tonight. I'd also like to welcome Lisa Belkin back to Princeton. I first got to know her when she was an undergraduate here and worked for the Daily Prince. I saw her byline and then had an opportunity to work with her on a conference that may have covered topics like this, but say several decades before. And so because we had a working relationship, I noticed very frequently when she had a byline in the New York Times when she was a regular journalist doing newspaper stories like we remember. But then her life began to change, and I noticed that she was doing feature stories in the magazine section of the New York Times, which she still does do, I think. Have seen you. And then at some point you were on the second page when there was some kind of a not style section and so on. And now she is a first-class blogger, and she's here at Princeton. She writes a blog called Motherlode, and you should look it up. She even writes about grandmothers. And so now she's here at Princeton and teaching a whole new generation of students what this new kind of journalism means. So I think we should be very pleased that Lisa Belkin is willing to talk with us tonight and be part of this series about this changing world of communications. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you for not saying exactly how many decades ago it was that you and I first met. I really do appreciate that. My mother has long believed that you should change. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Is this loud enough? No? Yeah? Okay. Do you want to? I had a feeling I wasn't echoing quite enough. I'll just keep talking until we can figure out when to start. Yeah, there we go. Okay. My mom long said that now we're too loud, that my mother didn't say that, that you should change careers every 7 years or so. She didn't just mean jobs. She truly meant careers. She started out in the era when all women were teachers or secretaries, and she couldn't type, so she was a teacher. And then she went to law school when I graduated from high school, and in between, she spent some years getting several PhDs in counseling and working in various school districts. And then most recently, she is teaching online. She's teaching business law online so that she can travel wherever she wants and talk to her students by computer. So Mom was adamant that you don't stay in one place and you don't do the same thing, and you change your identity and the way you work constantly. So of course I was quite sure I wasn't going to do that because Mom said I was supposed to. And I went into journalism, and I have been a journalist for 30 years, ever since I graduated from Princeton, started at the New York Times. It was my first job. It's the only place I have ever worked. And it was only fairly recently that I came to the realization that I'd done exactly what Mom said, because although I had been at the New York Times for 30 years, I was in a profession, and so many of our professions are now, that changed around me, that I had to change and adapt to because of the technology that is so dramatically different than it was an eye blink ago. And journalism is a remarkably salient example of this. My first day at the New York Times was the day the Washington Bureau first got computers. And I was a clerk at the time. Actually, my technical title then was copy boy. And copy boys back then were overeducated, mostly Ivy League graduates who thought a little too much of themselves and were told, there's the phone, go answer it. Oh, and in your spare time you can write stories and persuade us that we should let you do something more around here. Well, the reason they needed someone to answer the phone was because no one had answering machines, no one had voicemail. Literally then, you sat, you answered the phone, you filled out the messages on the little pink slips, and you put them on reporters' desks while making coffee. And writing in my spare time. The reason the job was called copy boy was because until the day I got there were typewriters on the desk, and reporters would type, and then as they finished a page, they would pull it out of the typewriter and yell, "Copy," and a copy person would come over and take the copy to an editor. And, it sounds like something out of the front page, and I missed it by about 24 hours. And I remember on that first day, there were reporters who couldn't help themselves. They were just so used to the old way that they were typing on the computer, which of course was crashing all around them, and it was quite the scene. And they were typing and typing and typing, and every once in a while, for no reason whatsoever, they would yell, "Copy," and then go back to typing on their computer screen because old habits die really hard. I eventually became a reporter for the Times, and by then we did have answering machines, but there was no remote yet, and so the office was the only place you could write. There was no concept of a computer at home, and in order to get work done, you had to come into an office and sit at a desk and type into a screen. And it defined the parameters back then. There was life and there was work, and the two were distinct, or as distinct as they were ever to be again at that moment in time. I went to the Houston Bureau after a few years of reporting in New York. I did finally elbow my way into being a reporter. Actually, I think it was because I was so bad at answering the phone, because I was always working on those other stories to convince them to make me a reporter, that I'm still introduced. There's an editor who is now a very big, important human, who still introduces me as, "This is Lisa Belkin. She's the worst clerk the Metro desk ever had." So by not answering the phones, I got myself a job in New York, and then I moved to Texas to be a national correspondent. And technology inches along. So in Houston, I did get my first desktop computer. Remember Dell, and it came in that box that looked like a cow, and it had the black screen with the amber type on it, which meant I could now write at home. I couldn't send anything anywhere. I had to take the big floppy disk and go back to the office and then put it in their computer where they had the phone and the couple, and remember the noise, that sound that it made when it transmitted. And that was the height of technology. When we were in the field, the way you communicated with the New York Times, one of the preeminent communication organizations in the world, was you called and you said, "May I have the recording room?" And they hooked you up with a tape recorder. And I would stand in the middle of airports and fields in West Texas and talk to a tape recorder and make sure to put in the paragraphs and the periods and the quotation marks and spell the difficult names. And then someone would transcribe it, and that's how it would end up in the newspaper. And it was still progress. It was still or lack thereof, I guess, which is one of the things we'll talk about later. It was more of an ability to time shift my life and my work. So I was writing at home. I could do it at 2 o'clock in the morning if I was sleepless. I was traveling and didn't have to get back to a telegraph office, which is the way the newspapers used to be put out. So the leitmotif through all of this is a change in technology that affects the way we all worked. It continued when I came back to New York. I had my first son was born when I was in Texas. And I came back determined to use the lessons that I learned in Houston and adjust my life, or adjust my work around my life in New York. So I asked for a cell phone. And I mean, they were the, remember Radar O'Reilly and MASH, those big bricks of a thing? And I was one of the first people at the New York Times to ask for a cell phone. Some of the reporters had beepers. They had pagers. But other than that, if the desk wanted you, they had to call you on a telephone at home, or that you gave them, or you called and checked in with them. The lines were prescribed. There were divisions. There were walls that don't exist anymore, but were already beginning to crumble even back then. And when I asked for this cell phone, for me, it was the difference between being home for bedtime and bath time and not being home for bedtime and bath time. I was a new mother. I had a 3-month-old at the time. And what I'd learned in Texas was they don't need to see you in order to edit you. Now, that to me back then was a revelation. When the way the Metro desk worked at that moment in time was you wrote a story. Now you wrote it on a computer without yelling copy reflexively, and you sent it to the desk, and you waited until an editor called you over, and you sat side by side staring at the same screen and were asked questions, and the questions were answered, and then you got what's called the good night from the desk. And I would sit and watch the trains leave. And this cell phone, which made me one of the first really annoying people to talk all the way home on Metro North, but it also bought me back an hour of my life. It was a use of technology to change the way we work, to change the work that we did. And eventually I took the whole act and moved it completely home. I'm trying to remember what year now, they all blur together, but Evan was about 3 at the time. I was newly pregnant with my younger son, Alex, and I opened a home office. I created an office above the garage with what at the time was the height of technology. So I went from the days where you had to go into the office in order to write, and then you had to bring your floppy disk into the office in order to write. And now I had my computer at home. It still didn't have a modem. It still had the little cupola and the awful noise. I had a fax machine and a printer. And I figured I had solved the life-work dilemma because I was going to be super mommy. I figured I would type with one hand and there'd be an organic dinner simmering somewhere on the stove. And I think I was nursing the baby while I did all of this. And it was a time where we were trying out these new toys and figuring out how we were going to change our work. And what we didn't realize is that work also was going to change us. My first day as a work-from-home mom went something like this. Evan, as I said, was 3. I was really proud of myself because I'd solved all the world's problems. I got up, I put on my Gap sweats, because what's the point of working from home if you can't do it in your sweats? I kissed my son, good morning. I had breakfast with him, and then I told him his babysitter was coming, and I was going to go off to my new office above the garage, and he proceeded to position himself outside the door of that new office over the garage and shriek his bloody little head off. Because he'd figured out that the lines were blurred. And he knew that when mommy was dressed in heels and hose and a suit, that mommy belonged to work. And when mommy was dressed in her Gap sweats, mommy belonged to him. And he was ticked off that I was home and I wasn't his. He knew before I did that this blurring of these lines came with unintended consequences, with surprises, and were not entirely perfect, and that I hadn't solved all of the world's problems. He eventually got it. I ended up having to, took 3 or 4 days. Finally, I got up and I got dressed and I put on the heels and the hose and the suit, and I kissed him goodbye, and I went to the local diner, and I had a cup of coffee, and then I snuck back into my own house, and I actually got some work done. But this, again, it was different, it was progress, and I was only just beginning to see how it was changing the very fabric of the work that I did and the profession that I was part of. Work was changing too during this time. Journalism as a profession was changing dramatically. The barriers were coming down. There was an informality. And it was because of all the trends that we are talking about. An informality between editors and reporters that didn't used to exist. Because when you are obligated to sit next to someone and wait for their permission to leave, when you have to constantly be telling someone where you are and what number you can be reached, there is a certain hierarchical relationship that starts to erode when you no longer have to do those things. And there's more of an equality and a collaboration. The newsroom itself was changing. There was a bit of a change in the divide between news and business. Because there was more interaction in the real world about the systems that we were going to put in place, about the way the newsroom was going to work, about the beginnings of the internet and advertising on that, the lines were not nearly as clear as they once were. This iron wall where the people on the journalistic side did not talk to people on the business side couldn't apply anymore because they were dealing with the beginnings of what would become the implosion of news and the end of advertising. And at the very start of that, they had to talk to each other and figure out whose problem this was, frankly. There was also a change in the relationship between reporter and reader. As I changed the tools that I used, I changed my relationship with my reader. When I was writing for the magazine, I started to use the word I for the first time. I came back to when I left the Times, it was on a contract with the magazine, and it was just at the beginning of first-person journalism in a huge way. And I think part of that was because there was much more of an immediacy between who you were and the people that you were talking to. Again, these barriers were down. Someone didn't have to go through 5 people in order to get to me. They didn't have to leave the message and have the piece of paper be left on my desk. There was a much more constant interaction between me and sources. There was the cell phone that was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and that more and more of us had. So I could be gotten wherever, and I would now be very likely to be talking to sources from my house. You're different when you're talking to people from your house or from your car or from the ball game. When they can get you anywhere, when you can get them anywhere, they're different kinds of conversations. When readers could simply call and get me directly, those are different kinds of conversations. When I started writing the Life's Work column for the Times, which covered all of this, it was, first of all, the first exploration in the Times of how technology is changing the relationship between life and work. It was also, interestingly, the first time that a reporter had an email address at the bottom of the column. And I started to get email. Every Wednesday my column appeared, and all day Wednesday I heard from people. It was a very one-way conversation, but it was new. It was not like anything I had ever experienced before. You used to send your stuff out into the world, and then a few weeks later, letters to the editor might appear. Now, you sent your stuff out into the world, and within minutes, people could email you and tell you what they thought, and it wasn't always nice, but still, it was revolutionary. And for a while, this whole conversation took place only in my inbox. And I would often write columns based on what the response was so that I could share the response with the people who couldn't see it because only I could see it. I wrote a piece a few years into my tenure as the life work expert for the Times called The Opt-Out Revolution. It's actually largely about Princeton women and Ivy League women who had taken their remarkable educations and their stellar resumes and left the workforce. And it was an exploration about why. And it caused a little bit of a stir out in the world. And it was also one of the first times that people could talk to each other, that the conversation became two-way. Because for one of the first times, the Times started experimenting with forums. That's what they were called then. And people could write, and their comments would be in a very illegible, difficult to read font, in a long string on the Times website, hundreds, thousands to this piece, thousands of comments of people responding to a piece and then responding to each other. Because the comments were numbered and they started talking to each other, which no one at the Times expected. We did not think that our readers were going to start having a conversation amongst themselves, and yet here on these forums, that's almost the first thing they did. And then I started to blog. And that takes all the trends that we're talking to a completely different level. The Times now has 74 blogs. You had no clue it was that many, did you? And on every subject you can possibly imagine. Mine is Motherload. It's about parenting. They have them about bicycling and about drama and about cooking and about health. Pretty much any topic you want to get on the Times website and talk about now, you can talk about. And I have gone from the time when I couldn't even get a phone call directly if I was not sitting at my desk, to a time when I write something and almost single-handedly put it into the newspaper. There are editors, so I will write a post twice a day, actually, and there are two sets of editors that have to read it because that's Times policy. But they don't really have to read it. And sometimes when no one's available and something has to go in, I just press publish. And I sit in my home office, which is now far more elaborate and quite a bit faster than it was when I first started, and I publish directly onto the New York Times website. And then people start to answer me. And they answer me by the hundreds. And what I am writing now is more like that game, you know, where you give the first sentence of a story and then the person next to you at the campfire tells another, and eventually you've told a tale. So much of the content, so much of the value of what we do nowadays is how people respond to what we do nowadays. And so I will write about the latest thinking in bedwetting prevention. Yeah, I'm writing really interesting subjects lately. And people will come and talk by the thousands about what worked for them. And the Times will publish a 250,000 cache of documents, and people will come and talk by the tens of thousands about whether or not we should have, and what they learned from this cache of documents. Writing news just isn't what it used to be. There are cons, there are downsides. There are the cranky people who want to point out pretty much everything that you have ever done wrong, real or imagined. There's the problem of fact, the very real problem of fact, because it's now almost an echo chamber. And the idea of what a fact is and where it originated and how to check it has gotten lost, or certainly has gotten much harder. I find it really interesting teaching students now. And even Princeton students have an interesting relationship with facts because they believe they simply exist. They found them online. They must be true. And the idea of sourcing something that you found on a website, well, it's a reliable website, and what do you mean I have to source it? What do you mean someone else came up with this thought first? And the newspaper has a similar problem. And readers are constantly throwing around facts in our comments now. I mean, if you think about the comment section of any of the blogs or news stories, people will come in with great authority insist that X is true. And that too has become part of the news pages. That too becomes how people get their news, is reading other people's versions of what they are absolutely certain is true. There is a remarkable fact-checking mechanism in this new mode. I write something, and within moments, people have corrected my spelling and my grammar. And this is a good thing, because given budget cuts, we have fewer editors to correct spelling and grammar. It is a more informal, organic organism than it used to be. And I think all of this both reflects and creates a different dynamic in the lives and mindsets of the people who are both putting it together and reading it. So my work, where it used to be what I did and where I went and then I went home, is now absolutely inseparable from my life. I have a computer with me at all times. I'm checking a blog at all times. I am looking for news at all times. And it changes my relationship with what I write and with my reader. I also think that the expectations of readers and their relationship to news has been changed both by the tools that they use and by the fact that we and the people we report on are also totally accessible. And so people ask me, is it journalism? Is what I do still journalism? It's a conversation. And you can be a Luddite about it and say, we should go back to the old days where the New York Times had a voice of authority and no one ever used first person and readers, knew their place and kept their mouths shut. Or you can be exhilarated by the conversation, which I am. I think that there's, it may not be journalism, but it's absolutely the future. And I'm actually proud to be a practitioner of it, even when they're correcting my grammar and my spelling. In the interest of the crowd participation model of news reporting, I want to open this up to all of you to either ask questions or give opinions and join on in. Anyone? Yeah.
Do you see in the future that the newspaper as a hard copy is going to disappear?
Yes. I mean, and I'm not the first to predict that.
Now, what then happens to people without computers?
So first I want to say that I do not speak for the New York Times. I mean, I don't want to pretend I do. Bill Keller does not tell me anything. So anything I say is me speculating, is not, some pronouncement about what the Times plans to do. But I would be very surprised if there were a daily New York Times in 10 years. I would not be shocked if there were not a New York Times in 5 in a paper copy. I suspect there'll probably be a Sunday paper for a good long time. What do people without computers do? What do people without telephones do? There comes a point at which a dominant technology becomes a ubiquitous technology. What do people without cars do? There was a point when that was a pressing question and it appeared to leave people out if you had a phone-reliant society. Well, we simply have one. And I guess the answer is libraries, which is not a satisfying answer if you don't have a computer. But it's become so ubiquitous that I think you get a computer. Yeah. You'll get it everywhere. I mean, you'll get it on your television, you get it on your phone. When was the last time any of you picked up a newspaper and learned something about what happened the day before? Interesting.
I don't know,
I not only read them, I approve them. I am the person who sits there and decides whether or not the comment gets posted. And when there are 500 of them, I don't do anything else. I think it is the only right way to do the job, though, because I do think it's journalism. I mean, jokes aside. It's reporting. If I am actually covering a subject matter, and I also do far more than bedwetting. I mean, it's sort of the philosophical, sociological landscape of parenting and how it fits into the Times, not the New York Times, the modern Times. And if I'm going to cover that, what better source than all these people who come to me? So I don't see it as a waste of time. I see it as reporting. Because in a way, it's almost cheating. You sit there, and people come and tell you what they think and what's important to them and how they view things and something, in ways that you have not thought of on the subject. From a practical level, the Times insists that its forums, that its blogs be moderated. You can't simply, whereas I can push a button and say publish, you can't. You have to have someone that they have vetted say, yes, that comment can go through. Really? Let's go on this side, yeah.
Of course it's true, I read it in the Times.
Uh-huh.
How are you trying to protect what's supposedly factual information?
They still do. I mean, they really do. The daily paper was never fact-checked, and it still is not, but we are beholden to fact. So when we get it wrong, there's a correction, and there's egg on your face. I mean, it is considered really, really bad still to get something wrong at the paper. Does it happen? Yes. And does it happen more than it used to? I would bet it does, because we're putting out more information with fewer people. It is going to happen. Human beings make mistakes. The goal is to correct those mistakes and correct it in the permanent record. In a way, it's easier to do in the era of the web because A, you have more eyes on it, responding to you more instantly. So, and you can go in and physically change it. So in addition to a correction, you can correct it. Because if what exists of the Times is this thing on a screen that's ever changing, you can fix a fact. So yes, there's the downside of the speed and the volume, but there's the upside of the rigor of more people telling you more quickly and the fluidity of the product. So we do the best we can. Yeah.
First of all, I love having a paper newspaper. It will be sad when I'm only reading on the iPad or on whatever. I thought it was really, two things really interesting. One, when something interesting happens in the world, the New York Times and the Washington Post and whatever else, send me an email saying something just happened. It was just a vote in the Senate. And I think that instantaneous, which speaks to your question of when did you read something that happened yesterday, just to get a view on that. The other thing I wanted, you might want to comment on, with this WikiLeaks, the article, the thing that was interesting was the editor of the Times having a front page explanation of the New York Times position and how it was handling publishing it, which I thought was.
And there are Times reporters answering questions, Times editors and reporters throughout the day. So people are posting questions and they're answering them. Again, all of this is technology lowering those barriers. Technology creating a back and forth and an informality to news gathering. Used to be you couldn't see the process. It was invisible. It always happened this way. News always went through incarnations. It's just you could only see the final product. Now you see them as they change. Decisions were always made like this, but you weren't going to put that whole explanation in the newspaper. There wasn't room. So this is now a window, like those restaurants where you can see the kitchen? Well, we now have a window onto the restaurant kitchen. Two things you said. First is the idea of missing the newspaper. I know we're filming this and I probably shouldn't tell this story for posterity, but there was a town hall meeting, they call them, early in the days of the internet, and Arthur Sulzberger Jr. addresses the entire New York Times staff, and people were asking about, the threat of the internet to print journalism. And he said there will always be a print paper until people take their computers into the bathroom. And that was right before the laptop became really popular. And so one day, however much after that, I see my husband heading toward the restroom holding his laptop. And I just shrieked. I said, you can't do that. It will be the end of civilization as we know it. So, I'm afraid the iPad can go into the bathroom. So I think the end may be relatively near. And as far as WikiLeaks, that is probably a whole other lecture. I find it troubling that we live in an era where, with the press of a button, you can embarrass entire governments. I think I probably would have made the same decision as the editors of the various papers did, because there's the problem of, if everybody's doing it and it's out there anyway, at least you're giving it some context. But I think the ramifications are huge, and I'm really uncomfortable and troubled by them. And that's probably all I should say, or this could become an entire conversation about WikiLeaks. Yep. I'm supposed to keep from working 24/7? Yes. Yes, and you can look at it too. Yes, it is a real problem, and it is not just a problem for journalists. It's a problem for everybody who has any device. Oh, mine isn't on me right now, but who has any device and any job where people feel entitled to reach you on that device. It's a two-edged sword, right? It has an off button, and you can look at it as the thing that enables you to work in a hammock at the beach. And if you didn't have it, you'd have to be at an office with your bottom in a chair, and this way you can work in a hammock at the beach. Or you can look at the thing that ruins your time at the beach. We don't use the off button enough. That said, we are now in a global economy where sometimes you can't use the off button if your job is to keep track of what's happening in Taipei. And you work for a website, as I do, that there are no deadlines anymore. It's constant. It's whenever you can get it to us. As quickly as you can do it, that is the deadline. So you work a lot. It helps to like the work you do. Yeah.
As a business model, do you think the web edition can support the kind of foreign viewers, national viewers, investigators?
I left that out as one of the downsides, the fact that it doesn't make any money. It actually does. As I understand it, the web is making money. It's not making as much money as Wall Street would like, and it's unclear whether it can continue to make the amount of money necessary to produce the news. That's the multi-billion-dollar question, and I am not qualified to answer it. I'm told my blog brings in more than it costs them. That's the one fact I know for certain. They are establishing the paywall on January 1st, and it's a huge experiment. And I suspect my readership will go off a cliff at first, because everybody has to get used to something new. I don't know the details, so I don't know what they'll be charging. I don't know when the charge will kick in. We're told that they are basically trying to make it so that you're paying the way you used to pay for a newspaper. The newspaper used to come to your house. If you subscribed, it came to your house. You wanted to read it once in a while, you paid for it at the newsstand. Sometimes your friend lent it to you. Their subscription. Sometimes your mother ripped out an article and mailed it to you. That's a potential way to use the web. If you use it every single day, you will be charged for it, like a subscription. If you use it once in a while, fine. welcome. I have no idea if that's a money-making model, and I don't know the details of the plan. Right now, it's like opening a restaurant and giving away the food for free, and then being really happy because you're crowded. It's wonderful that everyone's having a good time at your restaurant, but you're not going to keep your restaurant open for long. So we're about to find out the answer to your multi-billion-dollar question, and I trust that there are smart minds figuring it out, and it'll be an interesting next chapter. But I have no idea. Yeah, I hope so too. Yes.
With all these people calling you, contacting you, do you ever check the validity of what you
Yes.
said, or are there myths abounding, or there's some erroneous statements?
Yes to that too. Of course I check. I run a lot of reader mail. One of the things that gets the most response is when someone writes into me and says, I'm struggling with this, what do your readers think? And I make sure it's a real person. Do I go to their house and have them prove that their 5-year-old actually is reluctant to go to school in the morning? No. But I didn't do that before. And in a way, what we've done is increased the bandwidth from which we're getting our news. It used to be that if you needed an example of X, you were writing a lifestyle story and you needed somebody who, was an example of whatever trend, you wandered around the newsroom and you asked people if they knew anyone. And so they told you, their next door neighbor or their kid's kindergarten teacher, and so you called them. And because you probably shouldn't just be writing about, one circle out from New York Times reporters, you asked them if they knew anyone, and so they gave you some more people, and then you wrote your story. Now you need an example of X. You go online to the website where 10,000 people who represent X gather every day, and you ask if any of them want to talk to you. You're really culling from a far larger group. The danger is, are they real? But you have to figure out whether they're real the same way you figured out when they were real, when all they were was a voice on the phone and a telephone number. I mean, it's still reporting, and they can still lie to you. But it's my obligation to check. And yes, I do. I do not run a single thing, even if I don't use someone's name. I have at least satisfied myself that this is a real person. Yeah.
This is just an opinion question. Are you predicting the same demise for books and movies and...
I'm not predicting anything.
And the second part of the question is, a lot of things that you are talking about, are they age related? For instance, someone my age versus my grandchildren?
Well, first question is, there's not going to be a demise of books, movies, or news. It's the delivery system that's changing. Used to be that when you wanted to know what was happening, you waited until the special edition of the newspaper came out. Then you turned on the radio. Then you waited for the news at 6:30, and Walter Cronkite told you. Then we evolved into what we have now, which is the news comes to you and at you, and there's really no escaping it. But the news is the same. It's the delivery system. Books are the same. They're coming on Kindles and iPads and Nooks, but they're still books. Movies you can get at your house. You don't have to go to the movie theater, but it's still a movie, and what we find entertaining is still entertaining. So no, I don't think we're going to see the demise of any of these things. The question is, can we afford to keep producing them at the price that they're now going for? But if they start to go away, then they're worth more, and so we'll start to pay more for them. So no, I'm actually very optimistic about books. I mean, how many people here have some sort of electronic book reading device? Yeah. And you are the demographic that is not supposed to have them. So yes, of course it's generational. I mean, your grandchildren don't need to read directions on any electronic item. They take it out of the box and they use it. They're not the least bit intimidated by it, and they instinctively know how it works. And so all technology is generational. Once there are people who never remember a time when it didn't exist, then it's as established as, water from your tap. So yeah, absolutely it's generational. And that, in fact, most surveys that I've read show that that's what the divide is. It is not the who uses this technology is not what you might think it is, which is economic. It cuts across economic levels. It cuts sideways across generational levels. Where else do we have? Yeah. Right now, I don't think there are, but it is an interesting question. In other words, I consider myself a reporter. I'm a magazine reporter. My blog appears within the realm of the magazine, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to an outsider. It's just that an editor at the magazine thought, wow, people really respond when we run cover stories on parenting. And Lisa seems to know something about that, so let's start a blog. And so now when you pull up my blog, it says magazine on top of it, and nobody knows why. But I belong to the magazine and also write magazine cover stories and essays for the front of the magazine. I don't think there is a single blogger at the Times who does not have a background as a reporter yet. But I don't know if that's going to change. Because I don't know whether, eventually we will consider being a blogger, being a background in journalism. We're not quite there yet. As far as the other question you might be asking, and I'm not sure, is there sort of a status differential? No. No.
Question, isn't there a fear that with lack of newspapers that we're not going to be able to pay for excellent journalists?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to believe, because frankly I'd be too depressed to get out of bed in the morning if I didn't, I have to believe there is an enduring value in good journalism. And I think it might take a decline in that in order to make that clear, in which case there will then be a resurgence of it and people will start to pay for it. I don't know. We're living in really interesting times. And I thought I entered a profession that was going to stay exactly the same. And, my mother turned out to be right. I've changed my career, so to speak, every 7 years or so. And this is the biggest upheaval that there's been. But yes, there is good journalism costs money. A professor at NYU, Jay Rosen, has an interesting theory that can never be tested or will never be tested. He has argued that and I think he's named them all, if a dozen news organizations shut down for a day, 2 days, a week, I don't remember exactly what the proposal was, then we would have a measure of where our news comes from. Because now we have this idea that it's out there. You don't have to pay for it, it's free. And it's because we see it everywhere. But what we don't have a sense of is where the kernel of origin was. And I know that when I write something, suddenly I'll turn on WCBS radio and I'll hear a news story about this thing. And there's always a moment of disconnect. Like, oh, they know that too. Oh, they know that from me. And most news originates with a handful of organizations. If the top dozen shut down, you would not know what was going on more or less outside of the United States for sure, because few have bureaus outside of the United States now. There would be reporting from outside, sort of native soil reporting from these places. And perhaps it would get here and translated, but maybe not. And you'd have this, because right now there's a newspaper says something and then everybody comments on it and talks about it and reprints it and does additional legwork and adds to it, but it all starts somewhere. And that start costs a lot of money. And that's our problem. All the way up back.
Well, that makes me ask the question then, is journalism in the future going to be totally controlled by who knows the money? And I'm thinking, of course, now of certain news organizations which have really taken over what used to be independent newspapers. So is money going to be a controlling factor?
News has always been controlled by who has the money. I mean, who was it? Benjamin Franklin, somebody said, never argue with a man who buys his ink by the barrel. It has always cost money to get your voice out there. So I don't think that's changed. And actually, we've democratized it in a way. I mean, one thing the web has done is anybody who wants to get up and shout loudly can get attention. So that mitigates the effect of money, but you've always needed money to really be heard out there. I'm not teaching them anything different, I think, than I would have taught them 10 years ago, were I doing the same job, which is interesting. Because I thought a lot about, in an age of new technology, what do you teach? This generation knows the technology. They know the technology better than I do. And what they do want to learn is the technique. They want to learn how to ask the questions and how to interview and how to get someone to tell you things they don't want to tell you and how to bring someone's story to life on a page. The title of the class, for a bit of background, is Changing the World One Tale at a Time. And it's a narrative nonfiction writing class. So it very much is about capturing a reader's attention in a cacophony and focusing on one person or one tale and then using that to stand for a larger issue, a larger question. So what's interesting is how much it hasn't changed, actually, and how much validity I still I still think there is in those methods. Yep.
Arguably, this one went out to the New York Times and wide open last year for
I do wonder what would happen to the Huffington Post during Jay Rosen's blackout period. Because if you could trace the provenance of much of what appears on the Huffington, the Huffington Post is an aggregator with some original content, but the original content is often playing off or commenting on news that came from somewhere else. So, it's no secret that large news organizations are somewhat frustrated by the Huffington Post and the fact that things are just, I have found myself on there with modest attribution. I won't say none, but it does not appear at first glance like this was something I did first. You have to look. On the other hand, clearly it's filling a need. People go there and want to read it, and you have to respect that. If people are telling you this is how they want their news delivered, you can't tell them no, they're wrong. So it'll be interesting to see what Tina Brown does with the Newsweek Daily Beast merger and whether that'll go to the news side or the Beast side. Yeah.
In this day of where, like you mentioned before, things put on public language a lot, environmentally, coming out there, not only faster, obviously, but people comment and public language more and more.
Oh, you're so kind and polite. So diplomatic.
They just end up, well, I don't agree with that, and then someone reads their comment and says, oh, well, what do you think? Do you think that sort of lack of self-editing is a good or a bad thing?
It's a fascinating thing. It makes you realize that people were out there with opinions all along. So back when I was writing and it was going out into the void, and then 2 weeks later those snail mail letters were coming back, well, they were only coming back from people who really had the energy and to write a letter and put a stamp on it and make sure it got to the mailbox, which meant most people did not write. I don't know whether most people were this angry and just, complained to their spouse or their next door neighbor, or whether the anonymity had breeds some of this. I think it's a mixture of both. I think people were kind of, unhappy at each other, and then it stopped there. It never got to the Times. And I think there's something about anonymity. I know that the Times switched to a registration method several years ago, so about a year ago. So I've been blogging for about a year, and anyone could post. Now, I didn't have to approve all their posts, but anyone could post without registering. And then they required registration. And for a while, my comments just were cut way back, and gradually they inched back again as people got used to it. I won't say they didn't return to what they were. They are now higher than what they were, but I suspect that's just because time has passed and more people do this now. But the quality and civility increased. So when you ask people to do something as simple, it's not really identifying them. I can see their email address. I'm not sure people really understand I can see their email address, but they do know they've given their email address, and that alone is enough to make them behave themselves a little better. It has really increased the quality of the conversation. So I suspect part of the vitriol, I call them the cranky people, but some of them are really more than that, is because there's an anonymity and you can just vent, and isn't it nice to be able to just vent? Everyone should have a place to vent, and I seem to be it some days. But I also think that some of this was just what people were thinking all the time. That this wide spectrum of response means there's a wide spectrum of response. And it's fascinating on a sociological level to know that. Yeah.
Are you planning to go back and revisit the Princeton Women article and see what they're up to now?
I actually have. And I've stayed in touch with a number of them. They are exactly the sort of representative sample that you might expect. So there were everyone from Catherine Brokaw, who got a law degree, was beaten down by the partnership track on her firm, left, used her time away to get extremely involved in sort of local civic, save the world for the children, and build playgrounds, not highways sort of work. And she's now the Dean of Students at Emory Law School. So she's sort of yes, you can come back, you can find a job, and stepping out does not end everything. On the other end of the spectrum is one of the women, and there are 12 of them, so I'm kind of protecting her anonymity because she's asked me not to use her name. But shortly after the piece ran, about 6 to 9 months after the piece ran, her husband announced he didn't want to be married anymore. They had an extraordinary, messy divorce. And she was left, with the same story of the 1950s. Woman's husband walks out. She has no useful job skills, and she's struggling. Now, she had a Princeton degree, and she put her life back together, but she had spent 12 years at that point with no paid work on her resume, and it took a while to put her life back together. So, both ends of the spectrum. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about the future of investigative journalism. A couple of lectures ago, Peter Kahn, who's part of the Wall Street Journal this year, he spoke about ProPublica and Legal.com, but very few other web-based investigative journalism sources are there. Do you think in the future, in your world, where is going to become all necessary
WikiLeaks? I don't know. ProPublica, I actually wanted to go to there was a lecture earlier today by ProPublica, which I wanted to go to because I don't know enough about it. And I also, I guess, claim ignorance because it's just not the path I've been on. So I know it is the most expensive journalism to do. And it's probably, I would say, the most important journalism to do. And it, at the moment, is the most concerning journalism in terms of its future. And the answer is, I don't know. I do know that there's a lot of experimentation and urgency out there, and ProPublica is the one that comes up the most often. And I think it's an example of both the promise and the limits of what can be done. So it's, what it does is remarkable, and it doesn't get to do very much of it. I can do that. Can you pick them though? Because I don't want to be the one to make the choice.
One here, and should we take one on the other side of the room if there is one? But maybe only, oh, okay, in the middle.
You guys can think that there was always a New York Times full of facts, and when you do with the facts, or if there were any historical precedents, or there was better journalism, and then, you know, it fell off because people didn't want to pay for it, or have we ever been through anything like this before?
Actually, there was worse journalism. You know, there was the yellow tabloid. Let's start the Spanish-American War because it's in our business interest journalism, and things like the modern era of the great newspapers replace that. So no, I can't reassure you with that. As far as I know my journalism history, and I don't claim to be an expert, but what I know says no, actually the opposite happened. And now one could argue we're going backwards. Yeah.
How is the rest of the world doing? This was all the United States. Is that the same? The totalitarian countries still exist.
Well, those where the state doesn't own the press, yes, the same problems exist everywhere. American newspapers are larger, so their problems are probably larger, and many, at least, you know, the only ones I know well are English-speaking press. So Britain tends to be much more tabloid in the first place. There are more of them, but they've all gone online. And, you know, I know that Canadian newspapers are having the same difficulties. So yes, the economics of private news gathering are the same pretty much everywhere. Now, every place doesn't have private news gathering.